welcome back to another in our series of Webequie Supply Road live streaming sessions. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'll be your host for this and other streaming sessions to be done over the next few weeks, running to early December, focusing on preliminary observations from the baseline studies, then moving to other topics that will be of interest to our listeners and viewers. So the intent of these shows is to keep community members and the general public up to date with the environmental assessment as it moves along. We hope that these sessions encourage open, thoughtful, and informed discussion that will help make the EA as comprehensive as possible. And I just want to remind everyone that this is actually a call-in show, and you can see the number at the top of your screen. It's 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. And you're free to call in with a comment or a question. And today's topic is road design through Muskeg or in Muskeg. And the Webequie Supply Road is follows an interesting route. It out of the actual settlement part of the community, it follows generally to the east and then turns south. And when it's moving through these areas, it's slightly higher ground. There are more rock outcrops, a little drier, and then as it moves further south, it begins to then start to turn east. And that section to the east is what we're going to talk about today, and building in that section is definitely challenging. Um, but let's first talk about the Webequie Supply Road project study area. It's a very interesting landscape. It's dotted with many lakes, and there are many rivers and streams that run through there. In certain areas, you'd swear there's more water than there is land, particularly in the Webequie settlement area. And but probably the most interesting area, one of the most interesting areas, occurs along the eastern half of the planned Webequie Supply Road. So that's the sort of the eastern portion, or most of the eastern portion of the planned road. And this section of the planned road would run through what's called the James Bay Lowlands. And the James Bay Lowlands are a low-lying area that's essentially a vast wetland complex. And it contains very slow-moving waters that flow to James Bay and to Hudson Bay, mainly James Bay in the case of the Webequie Supply Road route. So that sort of gives you an idea of the setting, the geographical setting that we're talking about here. Maybe now we can move and talk a little bit about what muskeg actually is. So muskeg is basically defined as a peat-forming ecosystem that's found most commonly in boreal and Arctic climates. Now, when we're talking about Webequie, we're talking about boreal climates, the boreal forest. So the actual term or word muskeg, it actually is of Cree origin. Um, the Cree word being muskeg, which means low-lying marsh. So your next question might be, what is muskeg itself? Well, what does it consist of? Well, it consists of basically dead organic material at, in varying states of decomposition. And when I talk about decomposition, what I mean by is breaking down. So if you imagine, when you collect leaves and then over time those leaves break down, they break down into finer particles and they become changed. They don't look like leaves anymore. That's the process of decomposition. So, peat can contain sort of a variety of material at different states of decomposition. Can also contain small pieces of wood. So it's quite variable, actually. And but I think another way that people try to describe Muskeg itself is as a floating mat of, of vegetation. And this is probably the best example. So, I mean, many of you, I'm sure, you're out in the bush, you're walking around, and it's like walking on a sponge. So you take a step, and it looks like firm ground because it's got plants on it and little grasses, and and all of a sudden your foot sinks down a bit and it gets wet. And so that's walking on muskeg. So it just imagine this big floating mat of vegetation, and there's water underneath it, and so it's very squishy, and it changes in its squishiness over time. So it's because of that, it presents a lot of challenges within our project area, a lot of challenges, and that's why we're talking about it. And again, or what I do want to mention is that today we're talking about some of these challenges and how some of these challenges are dealt with. But this is a conversation that we're going to be continuing over the next while with occasional shows talking about building roads in these kinds of areas because it is such an important, very important topic. Um, so where is the Muskeg located in the project area? So it's located in, as I mentioned, the eastern portion of the Webequie Supply Road route, the planned Webequie Supply Road route. So it covers about 50 to 60 kilometers, almost half, if not slightly more than half, of the 107-kilometer long Webequie Supply Road. So it covers a pretty big area, and maybe well, we've got on our screen here a couple of shots, a couple of images here, and the image on the left is a muskeg area. So again, like I was saying before, it looks dry, but as you get closer and as you walk on it, it's definitely not dry. And then when you look at a shot like we have on the right, which is, I believe, a satellite image or extremely high aerial image, you can see just how variable this landscape is. There's some open water, and then there's some not so open water, but so it's kind of deceiving. You have these open water areas, but then you have these areas which look like they're all plants, but there's actually probably more water than plants. So it's a bit of a tricky it's a pretty bit of a tricky environment to navigate in. You can't use a boat sometimes. You can't walk through it sometimes. The winter's probably the best time to really get through it, to be honest with you. And so it presents a lot of challenges. So one of the key things to remember when it comes to uh, building in these areas is that the peat that makes up a lot of the muskeg that I was talking about, that decomposed organic material, the thickness of that is extremely important for us to understand if we are going to even attempt to try to build roads through areas like this. And for that reason, as part of our project, we conducted a what you call a ground penetrating radar survey or GPR survey. Um, and we did this a couple of winters ago through many of the areas where the road was going to travel, the lowland areas where the road was going to travel. So sitting down with the experts that went out to do this work, it was a we looked at the mapping, we identified the lowland areas, and then when they went out to actually do the field work, it was a question of seeing what areas they could actually get access to, because it's one thing to look at it from aerial images, and then it's another thing to actually be on the ground. And let me explain why they did that level of planning. So uh, the way it the way it works is that when you do these ground penetrating radar surveys, it consists of a snow machine with that's pulling a sled behind it, and on that sled is a device that sends radar signals through the ground. So it is dragged behind the snowmobile, and it has contact with the ground and sends these radar signals. So if you imagine the snowmobile moving through the snow, and then this device sending these radar signals down through the ground. And the reason why it sends these signals down is because the length of time it takes for that signal to come back, to bounce back, changes depending on what's under the ground, what's in the subsurface. So subsurface, when I talk about subsurface, I'm talking basically about whatever's under the ground, whether it's soil, rock, it could be clay, it could be sand, it could be peat, it could be lots of different materials. So this is a way that we can measure how thick the different layers are under the ground. And you can go to it has a maximum depth it's able to survey to, um, which is over 5 meters, I believe. And so we did this over the areas we could access, so where we couldn't always just do a completely straight line because sometimes there were trees in the way. So we had to go around those. But by doing this kind of work, we're mapping how thick the peat is along the approximate route. Now, it doesn't happen magically. So the expert is recording this information from the machine, as well as recording where the snowmobile is. So we have an idea of the location and then the depth, and then we see the signals that are coming back up from that radar signal that's sent. And the experts are able to look at the data after the work is done, and different materials transmit radar signals at different degrees. So the signals come back in different times. So then the expert will look at the data and be able to identify how thick the peat is approximately in different areas. So why is this important, you may be asking? Well, um, when you build roads in these areas, you don't always use the same approach. So different areas where maybe the peat thickness is greater or less will require different construction approach. And that might involve more or less labor and more or less materials. So by doing this kind of work, it helps our construction teams understand whether that route is really the best route technically, and also helps our engineers understand what kind of challenges they're facing from a design perspective, so they can design the road differently in different areas. So for example, if the peat is greater than 5 meters thick, which is extremely thick, the road has to be designed differently than if the peat is less than a meter thick. So all these things have to be sort of taken into consideration, um, as part of doing this work. Excuse me. And just a reminder to everyone again that this is a call-in show. They can call in with comments or questions about what I'm talking about today. And the call-in number, as you can see on the screen, is 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. Call in with a comment or a question, and we'd love to hear from you as well. So the next question that you may have is, why does Muskeg require special planning when building roads through these areas? Well, again, it goes back to what I was talking about before. You're talking about a floating mat of vegetation. It looks like it's firm ground, it's not. And so when you build on something like this, you have to do a lot of planning and preparation, because it's not what you call a consolidated base. And remember, as I mentioned before, that floating mat of vegetation, there's water underneath it, and that water is moving very, very slowly. It doesn't look like it when you look out. You don't see the water really moving, but it actually is moving very, very slowly in a direction. In our case, it's generally moving towards James Bay, towards the drainage, because most of the study area drains into James Bay. But it's really important to keep that in mind, that there is water underneath that vegetation, and that water is moving. It's moving slowly, but it's still moving. So because of this, it makes things more complicated when you're building and designing roads in these areas. Um, it's also a very significant and an environmentally sensitive area because you're building through wetlands like this. There's a lot of considerations, and we'll get into those very shortly. Now, some people might say, well, why can't you just build a causeway, like an elevated causeway across all of this? Well, the thing is you're talking about 50 to 60 kilometers of James Bay lowlands that this road would be traveling through. And that would be incredibly expensive. And not only that, um, the environmental impacts would be significant because you're talking about building so many bridge piers to support that elevated roadway through there. It's just not feasible. Um, and building those piers, it's very invasive work. It involves a lot of in-water work. So that is not an ideal situation. Um, so it's challenging. It's definitely challenged building in these areas. And let's talk a little bit about how challenging it is. You're, again, as I mentioned, you're talking about building on what's called an unconsolidated base. And the key thing to remember is you cannot excavate the peat layer to any great extent. Peat is extremely important um, source of carbon storage, and because of that, it needs to be kept in place to the greatest degree possible um, when you're building in these areas. So what what that means is you basically have to build on top of what is there, and at the same time, as I mentioned before, you've got to allow the water to move because the water's got to move underneath the road. Because if you don't, the water builds up on one side of the road, and that's not a good situation because then it can become drier on the other side, which can affect um, the habitat on the other side because it's expecting and it's the plants there are expecting to be living in a certain environment. And that environment's changed because there's less water available on uh, because the road is essentially acting as a dam. So the key thing is when designing these roads to allow to facilitate water flow, so that the water levels on either side of the road are essentially the same. So there's lots of different ways they do that. They do that by installing culvert pipes. And then the thing is depending on the areas, they would install more culvert pipes than in other areas because the need for water flow might be greater in certain areas than in others. So, and then you can see now on your screen just a simple illustration where if you're building a road through there, you've got those pipes put down, um, and you do not want backup of water on one side of the road. So you've got to make sure you ease that flow, you allow that flow across and underneath that road. Otherwise, you're going to dry out one area and another area will get oversaturated. Plus, you'll get overtopping of the road by the water building up on one side, and that can cause washouts, and then the road is not uh, uh, open and available. So there's lots of problems that can come from that. And oh, looks like we have a comment from Cheryl, and I don't know if we have that comment.
Hey Don, I
Let's
actually
see.
got that comment over here. If you want, I can read it out for you.
If you can, please,
Yeah,
yes.
for sure. So GPR, otherwise known as ground penetrating radar, was also used in the process of finding unmarked graves in other communities.
That's a great point. Thank you for that, Cheryl. Yes, it's an important technology, and this has been done over the last couple of years for that purpose, and it's been very helpful for that purpose. The technology is used in a lot of different areas. I think it originated in the mining area. You can do remote ground penetrating radar, and then you can do the direct contact ground penetrating radar. So thank you for your comment, Cheryl. That's a really important comment. And so let's talk a little bit further about building roads in Muskeg. And what I thought we'd show you right now is an animation we put together a year or two ago. And it's a simple animation, but I think the point of it is just to show you how a road would be built through areas like this. Now, it's probably an oversimplification, obviously, because different areas get treated differently, but it's to give you a general idea of how roads are built in areas like this using current technology. So if we can play that animation, which has a narration, we'll talk about that right after that.
After clearing the organic material from the road alignment, a geogrid will be placed on the existing ground, followed by a level of gravelly material to sort of build up the road to the preferred grade. On top of that, a secondary geogrid will be placed, followed by a final road topping. This will allow the road to sort of float on top of the Muskeg. In addition, culverts will be placed as needed to allow drainage to go back and forth, surface water drainage. Subsurface or groundwater will continue to flow naturally as the road shouldn't impede the flow. And there's the final road topping there, and that is how we will construct the road.
So that's our little animation to describe basically how the road might be constructed in these lowland areas. And before we go any further, just to remind everyone that this is a call-in show. You're free to call in with a comment or question about our topic today. And the number is 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. So I really like that animation. I think that animation is very helpful, and hopefully our viewers get a better idea of how it works. So the question might be, does the road basically sit on top of what is already there? And the answer is essentially yes. So the organic layer is removed, and then a geogrid is placed down. Now, what is a geogrid? So you saw that thing getting rolled out in the animation. The geogrid is like a plastic matrix. If you can imagine like something like snow fencing, orange snow fencing, something like that in rolls being rolled out over the road. Now, why do you use that? That would be the next question. Well, the purpose of it is to basically take the weight, so the weight from the load of the vehicles on the road, um, it's quite heavy. The loads are quite heavy. And what this geogrid does, this sort of plastic-like rolls of plastic matrix, is it spreads out the load over a wider area. And what it does is it allows the road to behave in a more uniformly, in a more sort of like standard way. So you don't get massive failures in the road in certain locations. So it spreads it out, it evens things out to allow the road and keeps the road more stable for a longer period of time. Yeah, there will be over time maintenance required on the road, but using the geogrid, and especially two layers like in the example, it strengthens that road by spreading out that load that is on the road. And then you noticed as well something I talked about before, which was the culverts. And so those culverts are installed to allow for free flow of water. And in areas, challenging areas like this, there are a lot more culverts installed. So they're installed at a more frequent interval because it's more important to get the water from one side of the road to the other so that you don't get that backup of flow, that backup of water that could overtop the road and that could dry out the other side because there's less water than that area is used to. So the culverts play a big role in this, and so there's a lot involved in this. Another question that you may be asking is how can fish move from one side of the road to the other? And of course, with the culvert pipes, they could move through the culvert pipes, but there are different types of culvert pipes. There's a lot of different variations of them, and there's a type of culvert pipe called an open bottom culvert, which basically does not have a bottom. It sits on sort of a concrete foundation along its sides, and so it would sit on the actual culvert sits on the the natural bottom of that area. So this is definitely more fish habitat, more fish friendly in that it's providing the same, it's sitting on the same habitat that was there before. And so these might be more effective highways, if you want to say, for fish. So that's one way that fish, the movement of fish can be sort of helped out when building roads through these areas. So as you can tell, there's a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to this topic, and this is just our one of our first shows on this topic, and we're going to dive into this a little bit more deeply over time. But we thought this as a first show, just as a refresher, because we have talked about this before. We thought we'd talk about it at this level and then drill a little bit deeper as time goes on. So, um, just as a bit of a wrap up here, I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to our streaming sessions. We hope you join us again in a couple of weeks when we continue our discussions. We're going to talk in 2 weeks about cumulative effects. But before we go, I just want to remind everyone, and particularly Indigenous communities and the general public, that they can engage with the project team in a number of different ways, whatever best suits them. And those ways include it could be focus group sessions where we have 4 to 6 participants. They could be community members, band employees. They could be uh, counselors, the chief. As diverse a group as possible is preferred. But these focus group sessions, we can talk about the project and different topics or questions about the project as well, and try to get a better understanding from community members what they're thinking about the Webequie Supply Road project. We can conduct community sessions, so these would be in-person sessions potentially. We always prefer to do that. It's always better to be in person and meet community members and be able to talk one-on-one in person. We also do virtual community sessions. We've done these before for our project, and in those sessions we basically do the same thing as we would in person, but we're just doing it online using video conference technology. Some other approaches might be drop-in sessions where we set up a table outside the northern store or a busy place, and then hand out material and talk to community members about the project just to make them aware of what's going on. We can do 1 hour, we can do teleconferences, we can visit your community and go on your local radio station and do a call-in show with a translator in your community. And we can do online surveys. So there's a lot of different ways that we can work with your community to get the project information out and to get input from you, which is what we're looking for, because we do this work to try to be as transparent as possible and solicit as much input as possible from the different communities not only in Webequie but in all the neighboring communities as well too. So before we go, I just want to thank everyone again for joining us, and we will see you again in 2 weeks when we talk about cumulative effects. See you soon, Miigwech.
Hey, Don, before we go, we got one more question from Cheryl.
Okay, great.
Where will the organic matter that is being removed for the 50 to 60 kilometers go? Do you know how much carbon may be removed in the process described in the simulation?
That's a great question, Cheryl. We do not know that yet, and that's when you're getting down more to detailed design. But it's a very good question, and those are good points to consider when we get into the detailed design as well too. So, uh, thank you for that, Cheryl. We're not at that point yet, but it's a very good point and something that we need to take very seriously. The degree of organic layer removal. Um, and so, thank you for that, Cheryl, and we'll note that comment. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl, for your comments. We really appreciate it. And we will see you again in 2 weeks. Miigwech.